Ladies and gentlemen, welcome from Comcast Business, Mike McEwen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mike McEwen from Comcast Business. I'm the Senior Director of Enterprise Sales, so my team is responsible for, and here comes the shameless plug, great access to the internet via Ethernet, wide area connectivity for all your locations across the nation and beyond, as well as intelligence of SD-WAN and managed routers on top of it. But and I ask you to bear with me. This intro will be short, but I'm exhausted. My former 3-year-old was up all night because today he's 4, and he was incredibly excited about that, so I'm not even sure where I am specifically. But I know my mission, and that is to say thanks to PACT for having us to this wonderful event. We're proud to sponsor it. Thank you for being here for what will be a wonderful and thought-provoking panel. And I will now bring up the man who needs no introduction based on his accomplishments as well as the fact that he was introduced before, Sam Stern. Come on up, please, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right. Hi, everyone. It's now my pleasure to welcome our panelists. You can all come on up, and I'll introduce them. We've got a great panel for you. We're going to talk about personalization here, and you're going to hear from each of them, and then I'll ask them some questions. We'll have a nice Q&A, and there'll be time for all of you to ask your questions as well. Make yourselves comfortable on our nice cushy couch here. Great. So we've got Abi Inglay, who is the Senior Vice President of Digital Distribution and Channel Marketing at AT&T Business. I'm looking at him, just double-checking that I got the title right. These gentlemen have long titles, befitting how many important responsibilities they have. We've got Brock Weatherup from Petco, or formerly of Petco. He was the Chief Strategic Innovation and Digital Experience Officer there, and this is news that was breaking earlier this week and your final day. Last week was his final day. He's looking for his next opportunity, so I guess, chat him up after our panel. And finally, we've got coming to us from London, and I'll try not to stand in your light here, Clemens Eichholzer, who is the Senior Vice President of Game-Based Assessments at HireVue. So we're really excited to hear from all of you. Clemens, I think we're going to hear from you first, so I'll leave it to you.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? It's great to be here. I'm coming from London, so thanks very much for taking the time to spend with us on this panel. I'll give a quick sort of follow-up on the introduction. So I'm based out of London. I was actually the founder and CEO of a predictive hiring and talent analytics platform called Mindex, a startup in London. And Mindex was focused on game-based assessments using machine learning in the background. And it was used by some large, in particular European companies, game-based assessments to identify and evaluate talent. Mindex was bought by HireVue roughly a year ago, and since then I've been super busy working with the other members of the HireVue exec team to integrate our product range, integrate Mindex into HireVue, and hopefully launch an exciting product for our clients. Not sure how many of you guys are familiar with sort of our product, the HireVue product. HireVue is basically an HR tech company, an HR software company, and we work with some of the largest employers globally and really help them with talent assessment, talent identification in sort of different ways. The core product of our solution is video interviewing. We were actually, or we see ourselves as the pioneer in video interviewing, and have been doing this for many years, and by now have facilitated 10 million video interviews through the HireVue platform for our enterprise clients. We currently have around 750 enterprise clients, they happily use our video interviewing platform. We don't only stop there. We actually also add video analytics and assessments to our product, and that's really, I think, the juicy part, the interesting part I would like to focus on this panel and in front of this audience. Video analytics basically means that the candidate can take a video interview on our platform. The answers are recorded, and then we use artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to really evaluate the potential of that candidate and look at measuring job-relevant traits, job-relevant competencies through the recorded responses through the video interview. We actually, through the acquisition of Mindex, have added game intelligence to our platform, which now means we not only evaluate candidates based on their responses in video interviews, but we also ask them for an increasing range of our tours to complete video games. Short video games that typically last around 3 minutes. A candidate typically plays a suite of video games between 2 and 4 games, for example, in one assessment. And based on how they interact with the video game, how they perform in the video game, we collect additional data that we can use to evaluate the traits, the competencies of the candidate, make a prediction whether that candidate will have good job performance and has high employability. Focusing on the sort of core product of HireVue first, the video piece, and looking at this from a candidate perspective. So what are the key advantages? I just outlined basically 2 of the most obvious ones. The candidate can take this video interview whenever and wherever they want to. So we call the product on-demand video interviewing. So the candidate can log into the app or can visit a sort of end employer-branded HireVue platform and then really complete the video interview, record their answers to the questions that form part of the structured interview. Key advantage, as I said, is that candidates can do that whenever they want to. They may be in job A, but they may be considering job B. It's very hard to sort of take an interview outside business hours. With our system, it's obviously quite easy. They could do this interview very early in the morning before they're going to work or right in the evening after they come home. They can do so in a very comfortable setting for them. They can basically use their mobile or use our web portal to literally take the interview as long as they have internet connection from anywhere they choose to. And you could see in the earlier slide, maybe mentioned this as well, these are actually 2 aspects that are very happily picked up by candidates. So more than 1/3 of the candidates are actually using sort of the mobile interview functionality that we have, and more than half actually choose to take the interview outside business hours. And this is based on roughly 10 million interviews that we have facilitated so far. Adding games to the assessments is another aspect that we think contributes very strongly to a candidate-centric, candidate-friendly experience. I think it's quite intuitive that gaming per se is something that a lot of very significant parts of the population enjoy. It's actually not only young males who enjoy these games. When you look sort of at the kind of games that we are offering, they're reminiscent of cognitive training games, of puzzle games. They're actually also hugely popular among women. So popularity is really across gender, across age, and across ethnicities. Games we have added to our platform because we wanted to be in a position where we could offer the, in our view, most exciting, most powerful next generation modalities, assessment tools, and that is video and gaming in one infrastructure to really help identify talent and assess candidates in the best way. Comparing this to the traditional way, very often lengthy surveys, question-based, psychometric tests are being used, which we think don't really contribute to a very candidate-centric, candidate-friendly process. On the other hand, with our tours, the candidate can enjoy an interactive video interview. They can then play a bunch of games and basically have a quite short assessment experience, but hopefully something, and that's based on the feedback we're getting, is engaging and fun and really allows them to express themselves in a positive way. Thinking about the candidate perspective, and that's really sort of the focus for this presentation, we obviously also have significant ROI, sort of process ROI and outcome ROI for the employers we're working with. But thinking about the candidates here, primarily, one other aspect that we have seen enjoys sort of great satisfaction among candidates is the feedback. So once they've completed one of our video and game intelligence assessments, they receive an automated feedback. In many workflows, actually, it's already improvement that they hear back in a timely manner whether they got the job or made it to the next round or not. But we sort of added on top of that automated feedback that is really growth mindset oriented and really helps candidates also to develop themselves. Because for many jobs, as we all know, there's only a very small percentage that candidates actually are successful, that actually end up getting the job, and there's a lot of people who end up not getting the job. They put in a lot of time in the application process, and very often it's a black box. They don't hear anything how they did. They get nothing out of the process. So with that feedback functionality that is actually configurable, many employers actually want to provide that feedback, some choose not to. We can also offer that. But with that feedback, we think we create a more candidate-friendly, a more candidate-centric process. We also include some developmental tips and phrase it in a positive but authentic way to help candidates, hopefully, with their journey for other jobs. One of our core customers, for example, is Delta, and they call such a functionality actually to create a process for the disappointed, because so many candidates don't get the jobs, and in many cases, candidates that don't get the job, you still want to keep as customers, obviously, so you want to give them as much of a good experience as you possibly can. Very briefly, I know we're running out of time, a lot to talk about, but I think some of the potential follow-up questions we can address in the interactive session thereafter. Very briefly, though, on the front end, I mentioned we are using video games, and we are using recorded video interview functionality to basically create a more candidate-friendly, engaging process. In the back end, we are actually using, and I had mentioned that initially very briefly, artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to really make sense of the data that we are collecting through the modalities video and gaming. I think it's also quite intuitive that as you record a video answer and as you interact with a quite fast-paced, immersive, adaptive, interactive game, you actually provide a lot of data by doing so. And that data is being used by our machine learning models to gain insights. Very briefly, for video intelligence, for example, that means that we analyze the content of your response, but we also analyze the vocabulary you're using. We are analyzing, for example, whether you're using more abstract or concrete language. Are you using technical terms? Are you using fill words? All these things, all these features, how we call them, can be considered in our machine learning models. And depending on which model it is, for which role and which organization, play a more or less important part in the whole talent evaluation, talent identification process. We don't only stop with the text analysis, we actually also add audio analysis to that. That basically relates to things like intonation or sort of how the variance of your voice. All these things are also being covered and analyzed through our algorithms. On top of that, the third component would be expression analysis. Just it's always a little bit tricky with the terminology. We don't use face recognition, but we use expression analysis. So we look at the emotions that you're conveying while you're recording the answer to your interview. So, you know, from that we can sort of draw conclusions, for example, on your empathy levels or on your team work abilities and on many other things, such as perseverance. So really interesting that we can mix and match the games and the video questions into one assessment, not using any surveys or questionnaires, sort of what we call the legacy traditional assessments, and come up with a very high prediction accuracy as far as predicting job performance, as far as predicting employability in candidates. And while doing all this, creating a more candidate-friendly experience through a shorter process, gaming and video, typically, as I said, fast-paced media, and we can collect a lot of data within a short period of time, and an interactive, engaging experience. And that's really sort of the goal that we are pursuing. Very important, last very important point I want to make here is bias and adverse impact. That is something that some companies have been in the press maybe not always in a favorable light, that they may have used algorithms to help them identify talent, hire talent, and they ended up with actually reduced diversity. So they ended up hiring more basically of the same people. They replicated their human bias in basically an algorithmic approach. There's actually ways to avoid that and eliminate that. And that's something that HireVue is extremely focused on. So we go through very rigorous adverse impact analysis and adverse impact mitigation and elimination. It gets quite complicated. There's sort of a cross-functional approach that we are applying. So we have data scientists, machine learning experts on the one hand, but we also don't dismiss the decades of insights that have been gathered in the field of psychometrics and in the field of industrial organizational psychology. And a lot of sort of processes that have been used in this IO science to address and identify and eliminate bias can actually be replicated in a more efficient way now if you put a data-driven approach on top of that. And that's exactly sort of what we are doing. So we can remove features that may be good at predicting job performance, but also cause bias. And we are still left with enough features in our models, since we're collecting so much data through our modalities, that we can achieve high prediction accuracy, predict if someone is good at the job, predict if someone is suitable for the job, predict if someone has high employability, without sort of creating or sort of systematically creating bias that is very often the case in human judgments and human interview scenarios. Very briefly, last slide, I want to say we also do more than also only looking at adverse impact. We also are very strongly focused on, for example, diversity and inclusion, in the sense that we can adjust our games and also our video intelligence questions and evaluations to take into account certain disabilities. Color blindness is an obvious one. For example, in the games, we only work with color palettes that also are friendly towards sort of the major types of color blindness. So these people would not be put as a disadvantage. It's always, we are creating assessments that are hopefully engaging and scientific, and we really stress diversity as one of our core missions. We want to democratize the hiring process and not create assessments that discriminate unfairly against certain gender, certain age, certain ethnicities. I know I've been overrunning a little bit, so I'm going to stop it here. We can maybe talk about more of these topics during the interactive session. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Okay. Imagine if you had a situation where the fulcrum, the wheel, plastics, and semiconductors were all invented at the same time. Okay? That would be pretty mind-blowing, wouldn't it? It's that kind of period, though, when there are so many different things that are happening currently. We have a scenario where a convergence of technologies ranging from 5G, edge computing, AI, Internet of Things, virtual and augmented reality, all coming together to create the kinds of Lego blocks, of building blocks that can deliver hyper-personalized experiences that are going to reshape everything, from your shopping experience to actually helping visually impaired people see. Okay? And rather than go into the details of these technologies, what I'd really like to do is give some real-world examples of prototypes that we're working on or real-world companies that are actually being powered by these technologies today. And as a company that plays in virtually every one of these areas right now pretty extensively, we believe that empowering companies to hyper-personalize these experiences for their customers is radically going to change these experiences going forward. Let's take a look at the first example. This is a prototype that we've been working on with several companies. You can call this one of two things, the endless aisle for a retailer or a magic mirror. The example you're seeing out here is actually a mirror which is powered. It's a camera. It's a two-way sensing mechanism. It's powered by edge computing. And what you're seeing in real time is a rendering of a person's image then being rapidly draped over with augmented reality. This example shows a woman looking at the mirror. She has a bright red dress on. Might be a little too bright for her. And she is saying, how about I look at it in garnet? Okay? Now, this can basically give you access to an endless series of things you could try on rapidly. Imagine you could just hold up another dress with a barcode or RFID, and it would instantly show you how you looked in it. With one swipe, you could change the colors, accessories, no issues. You can try it on with scarves, different shoes, dresses. Facial recognition algorithms could pull up your profile, could actually show you the dresses in your size. It could tap into inventory systems. And by the way, tell you whether something in your size is available there, or frankly in the warehouse, in which case it will be shipped to you. This is a reality that is coming true right now because of the convergence of technologies that you have just seen out here. What seemed like magic a few years ago is now becoming a reality. Okay? Now, this is about personalizing the shopping experience, but there's nothing more personal than a person's health and their life. And the next few examples I'm going to give you really start getting into those areas, and I get super excited about these. Okay? We work with a company called Aira. It's a startup, and they are devoted to changing the lives of people who are blind or what they call low vision individuals. And they face issues navigating life in scenarios that are as mundane as going into a cafe and being able to read the menu and place an order. Okay? And we think hyper-personalization can change their lives in a way that they never thought possible, helping them literally navigate through life. These Aira customers are called Aira Explorers. And when they put that glass on, They are literally looking through a camera, and all the information on that camera is connected via a series of private networks on AT&T's wireless network, which then streams back to a control center, which has trained representatives who are literally seeing the world through their eyes and describing and guiding them through placing an order, running a marathon, and it's life-changing for these folks. It's life-changing. Now imagine that augmented with AI, augmented with a whole bunch of different technologies that makes it more and more and more efficient, and soon you'll be able to change and hyper-personalize this experience. It doesn't just stop here. This is the example of AT&T's platforms really empowering a company to go and do this as a startup. But you can also take, as Scott put it earlier, teach a Goliath to dance, okay? Or how a Goliath strike back. So the next company I'm going to show you is actually even older than AT&T, which is hard to do. We're 143 years old, okay? This company was founded by a Civil War veteran who was an amputee, James Edward Hanger, founded a company called Hanger Orthopedics, okay? Before I go there, let's play a video about Ira. Let's play the video on Ira, please.
Ira is a game-changing technology that connects people who are blind to highly trained, remotely located agents. Using a smartphone app or Ira's Horizon smart glasses, a user streams live video, geographical data, and other metrics to an agent. Through the AI-powered agent dashboard, agents are immersed in a user's world to provide visual information for any task, on demand. Ira, the description of life.
Pretty amazing. Gives me goosebumps every time I see this video.
Ira is a game-changing technology.
Can we, yeah, there we go. That's why they played it again. So James Edward Hanger founded Hanger Orthopedics. He was actually the inventor of the peg leg, which was a groundbreaking innovation at that point in time, okay? And if you really look at what that company has evolved into, it's the world's largest supplier, one of the world's largest suppliers of prosthetics. The issue of fixing a prosthetic is a very personal experience. It takes a lot of observation, trials in the field, watching somebody's gait, mobility, and if people are not satisfied with how it works, they just stop using it and lose the benefits. The question was, how do you get this information in real time, all the time, to those clinicians and actually adjust the prosthetic? And that was, again, done through AT&T's network using a connected prosthetic feedback mechanism that allowed them to do this in real time. Let's just play a quick video to sort of experience what it feels like.
It all starts with a conversation. The AT&T Foundry helps customers explore the art of the possible. Hanger is innovative in their field. They are the leading prosthetics and orthotics company in the US.
We see about 1 million patients a year, between 700 and 800 clinics across the United States.
Our CEO has a vision of becoming the most connected orthotic and prosthetic company in the world.
How many people have you heard of who get their leg, try it out, it's painful, and it ends up in the closet?
Right.
So we're going to be able to see this and be able to identify pathways to help them.
Not only is it just cold, hard data that you can actually monitor, but I think the cool thing is that it opens up the line of communication between like patients and prosthetists.
This motion sensor that we put in allows them to capture all this information in real time. So they're able to keep track of not just step counts, but their activity and how well each step is actually taken.
Ultimately, mobility is tied to quality of life and patient satisfaction. So we want our patients to be as mobile as possible to reach their highest potential.
We can help empower them to reach their goals and have higher mobility throughout the rest of their life.
I think there's a whole realm of possibilities of what we're going to learn with a device like this. It's not a job, it's a calling. We get up every day to help empower patients to reach their potential.
Scott referenced this earlier. The power of a platform is one that allows others to innovate. Frankly, when we rolled out the 4G network, we had no idea what it would do. Okay? The sharing economy was enabled by that. If you'd asked us, could we have predicted it? Answer is absolutely not. And that's why it's important for you to co-innovate and work with people. I'm going to do one more, okay? Because this is about changing lives. It can also improve the end of life. We're working with a company called Vitas, which basically provides end-of-life care for patients. And with Vitas, we are working with hyper-personalized experiences to allow people to live out their last wishes and in hospice.
And this is Jesus Cepeda, and Jesus was a World War II veteran who was actually injured in the Pearl Harbor attack. And Jesus never got to visit the places that were erected as memorials for World War II veterans. And he relived and visited all of those experiences through an immersive VR experience, VR, AR experience. Now imagine pilots who are at the end of their lives who get to do one last flight, or people just walking to their old hometowns. The possibilities are really endless. It's what innovators like you will do, taking the technology that I talked about earlier to hyper-personalize people's experiences. And the interesting thing is we live in a world where there's so much negativity. There's talk about cyber attacks, and there's talk about terrorism through social media. But not often do we talk about the kind of life-changing experiences that technology can bring for you. I, for one, are incredibly optimistic about what this holds for us and what it portends for us and our children going forward. Thank you.
Well, I get to follow that. So he's changing the world, making lives better for people, and I'm just going to talk about how we sell more stuff. So apologies for not having life-changing things here. My background is entirely around being in the mind of the consumer and how to sell product or services leveraging technology. And personalization has been kind of at that core. So my entire mindset or my entire perspective is literally around how are we all thinking about what this looks like. So just as context, right? All of 10 years ago, right, we used to watch TV by going and appointment viewing, right? And you'd sit down and say, okay, look, it's on 8 o'clock on Wednesday night. None of us really think about that anymore, right? Because this little company, called Netflix has created a little bit of a dynamic here where we're all watching TV differently. It's all of the same content, but it's personalized to each one of us. We all may have a Netflix account, but we're all watching it differently. What's being presented as opportunities and personalization is very different between all of us. So if you think about the function of hyper-personalization, right, it's really all about me. It's about each of you individually. It's not a group of people, right? And as we think about the dynamics of what we need to do to reach the consumer of today, right, it's about individuals. We don't talk about customers. We don't work with customer groups, but we have to use personalization to make that feel one-to-one. And companies that are winning are defining individuals and how to talk to them and how to leverage and use technology with that. So, whether or not when I was living in Philadelphia up to a few years ago, I'm a big New York Rangers fan. So not necessarily the best place to be a New York Rangers fan in, Philadelphia Flyer County. But I built a company before getting the pet space called Fathead. So those of you who are sports fan, they're big kind of wall graphics you stick on your wall. But you had to get personalization right in that format. So yeah, geographic setting would say I should be a Philadelphia Flyers fan, but I'm not. I'm a New York Rangers fan. Actually, I was one of our best customers or our customers' profiles in a market because if you were the other team in a kind of enemy market, you were likely to buy Fathead far more, frankly, than the people who were in that market because I wanted to show it off. I wanted to present that. I wanted to do that. And marketing to me was really important to talk to me as a New York Rangers fan, not as a Philadelphia Flyer player. So as we think about kind of pet owners, roughly 75% of you in here have a pet at home. This is kind of always a funny thing. We look like our pets a lot, and the dynamics of that, so kind of twinning relative to pets. My favorite is Peyton Manning down in the bottom middle, and him and his dog. But the dynamics of it are those do really happen, and how do we as a company take a look at what some of that is? So who are pets, right? And so these are all dogs, so kind of solving in that sort of basis. But dogs are matched with people, right? And how those people interact with those dogs are very different. Now, if I have cats, it has a whole other dynamic. And so when trying to think about digesting data to be able to say, hey, how do we personalize? Obviously, the matrix is pretty darn complicated. We have the opportunity at Petco where roughly about 85% of our customers are using our loyalty program, so we know that it's an individual buying certain exact things to be able to kind of facilitate what that looks like. And so as when you pull all of those dynamics together, you try and get really personalized. What a one-year-old Chihuahua owner needs versus a one-year-old Retriever owner needs are very different. And what do those things look like? And there's lots of dynamics, especially in the pet space, where we can use data in different ways. Our ability to take medical data from a veterinary practice is obviously very different than what we would use on the human side of being able to pull that data in and how we leverage some of those things. But you also have to be really careful because in some respects, some things that would make sense are not true. This is me carrying my golden retriever across a stream that, oh, by the way, if you notice, my feet aren't getting wet. He is terrified of water. He literally will go on hikes with me and will not cross running water. Now, every other retriever I've ever known, every breed specific would say that retrievers love water. And so how do you make sure you maintain that without kind of going too far? Because if we're personalizing to me as a retriever owner and we send an email to me that has, here are great toys for in the water, it just doesn't work for me, right? It's just not even something I need to do. But we have to be careful about trying to get kind of that level of personalization. So a couple kind of really just basic data points on the importance of what that looks like. We all want that personalization. We all crave that personalization. We all want to bring that into our lives. It makes our experiences better when we let that happen. We also have to be very, very careful to not get it wrong. So if we're in a position, because it's much easier to lose a customer by personalizing incorrectly than it is to personalize correctly, right? You can go through and have a whole number of things. You can talk to me about me and my water-hating retriever named Boulder, and we can have that conversation about what he needs as a 7-year-old retriever and all those things that goes along with it. But if all of a sudden tomorrow I get a communication or somehow you're communicating to me that I'm a cat owner, well, that you've lost me. You've lost the relationship that you've built with me, and it only takes one time to get it wrong to, for creating that sort of dynamic. We're expecting as consumers, we're getting further and further along on the strata of we're expecting that conversation to be personalized, to be individualized, and being created for who and what we are and how we want to think about that. And so as we talk in a little panel a little bit more about how do we think about that sort of personalization, how do we think about hyper-personalization, we have to be mindful about how far that goes. And so one of the key things that I always think about it is we have to be careful not to overcomplicate it. When I first got to Petco a couple years ago, one of the conversations as we worked through all of our data and what we're trying to do was, I was like, look, let's just not overcomplicate it. And it's really basic under some of the scenarios. Like, yeah, you should know that I am Brock Weatherup and I own an 8-year-old retriever, and yeah, I live in San Diego, and yeah, he's not a chewer, but he likes natural foods, and he has an allergy against this. You should know all that, and that's great. But start with the fact that I just have a dog, right? I don't have a cat, I don't have fish, I don't have birds. Just start there, right? And then build slowly as you get better and better in how you move that going forward. And a lot of companies, when they think about personalization, we'll talk about this a little bit more, jump to, I should know every single thing about what it is and make sure it's perfectly tailored against that, when most companies just need to take a step, get really great at that one step, then take the next step, and take the next step, and take the next step, but not to jump all the way to the end. So we're going to jump into a bit of that discussion. So, great.
All right, thank you all, and we'll have time for some of your questions coming up, so be thinking about what you might want to ask these gentlemen here in a minute. Something that struck me as all three of you were talking in terms of personalization is the ability for someone, an individual who you think you're trying to get to know, you're collecting all this data about them and about their pet and their pet relationship, and suddenly that relationship could change. Right? If you give someone a prosthetic limb, suddenly they're not, wanting to understand what is an accessible way to enter this building. They're wanting to get back into gymnastics, as that last person was. Or if they didn't get hired, they go from candidate for a job to potential customer of yours, and you have to understand as they switch context with you. So I wonder, how do you think about that as you're collecting this data, as you're trying to personalize experiences, but also knowing that you could be sharpening and sharpening your understanding of what they want in their relationship with you, and then all of a sudden they could have a state change where they become an employee, or they become not a candidate anymore. They're a dog owner until they're not, right? I'm about to go through an end-of-life experience with my dog, and we won't be a dog owner anymore. I don't want a happy birthday to my pet after his last birthday happened, right? How do you think about that in terms of the state change that can happen when you're trying to personalize experiences?
Well, I'll give a couple examples on the pet side. Again, I'll use one, which is a really an unfortunate example that happened where, and this gets to cleanliness of data, especially on the consumer side. So how do you make sure you do that? So, we've got, 1,500 stores, we've got 25,000 employees, we've got 30,000 pet owners that are in our database. If I come into a grooming salon and I get my, my dog groomed, and then all of a sudden I go back in and, okay, the groomer is like, well, Brock, why haven't you come in? And like, well, actually Boulder passed away. And all of a sudden now a person goes in and types in notes in their, in the system. And so this happened because I got the email for it, but somebody had typed in the pet name and wrote dead. So we then do wonderful things of personalizing to somebody that says, dear blank, you know, blah, 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 right, in a subject line. And the email was sent of, you know, hey, dead, you buy your food, right? And like, it's just, you know, it's dynamics. You have to be like super careful about it. Now, okay, there's lots of ways to filter, avoid a bunch of those things that can help avoid those sorts of things. But you have to be really careful, because now that was a perfect note for the groomer who was standing in the spot. They were going to see that customer again. It was a perfectly logical thing for that person. But as that data then kind of flowed downstream, lot of scenarios with it. We deal with a lot of, okay, if we have auto ship of food and those sorts of dynamics, if we start to see transactions, we've started to figure out ways to pull back to go, okay, this is starting to happen off cycle. Now, have they just left us as a customer, or are they no longer a pet owner? And how do you keep reaffirming some of those things, and using click data and other things are what we use to say, okay, patterns are staying or patterns are not, and how do you then kind of create some scoring against it to go, okay, maybe be careful about what that next thing is to do.
Yeah, that's a great example. We just switched the food we were buying for our dog because he's got a tumor and he can't chew his hard food anymore. So that's a sign, right? That's a good example.
Yeah, maybe thinking about sort of our use case, the switch in status, I think the most important one is to switch from candidate to employee. And we sort of, traditionally our focus was very much on talent acquisition and hiring, sort of with a very transactional sort of mindset. But it's obviously a very natural sort of diversification for us into internal mobility, employee development, identifying what sort of the trait profile of a candidate looks like, how this could work in other sort of roles, and where they would have to, for example, upskill and all these things. So for example, a lot of our customers are now asking us about, and that has been mentioned, I think, in previous panels as well, learning agility and learning potential. So if we can sort of, as part of the hiring process, also identify and assess that, it's actually very useful throughout, if you want, sort of the whole cycle, transitioning from candidate to employee. And the other sort of example that I had briefly mentioned that you were addressing, sort of candidate versus consumer, that is obviously something that for any large consumer-facing brand, be it a large food retailer, be it an airline, it really doesn't matter, is hugely important. And I think our sort of natural DNA at HireView is that we want to create the best possible candidate-centric, candidate-friendly, engaging experience per se. If you have a consumer sort of brand employer as a customer, you can add additional things to that. For example, you may give rejected candidates a voucher that they may get a drink on the next flight they're using. That's actually being done. Or you can sort of give them a discount for their shopping experience. So really sort of create a very consumer-friendly process on different levels and different layers.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, and partly what your tools are doing is enabling more candidates to go through a hiring process, which means you have more people who got rejected, which means you have more customers or potential customers with that bad impression. So I think you're right. It's even more important to reach out to them and say, we still value your business, even though we didn't have a fit here.
Absolutely. It's sort of, I think, where the technology goes, right? It's so easy for candidates to apply to multiple jobs, and they all expect increasingly to be treated as consumers anyways. That's true for candidates, for employees as well. And we can certainly help with that process. Just also, I mean, everyone knows sort of a software-enabled business model just allows us to sort of deal with ever-increasing applicant pools in a more efficient way, sort of from an employer's perspective. But that is also something sort of using automation where it makes sense, and to also create actually more humane and more candidate-centric hiring process. Doesn't sound maybe completely intuitive, but it is actually something that can be done in a quite good way, is something we are very much focused on.
Sam, let me give you an internal example. I think the point you made about hyper-personalization and getting it wrong is really important, because we have a really large workforce, okay, 250,000 people. And we are actually shifting from a hardware-based model of how we deploy a network to a software-based model. Now imagine what that means for the employee pool. Somebody who's used to have a skill set of going in and putting a box in place and wiring it up, now suddenly has to shift into doing a chef or puppet push using a DevOps methodology. That is a pretty far bridge to cross. So one of the things that we are facing is a cliff in terms of how do we reskill employees. Now, if you follow just the existing profile of employees, you're going to be sending to these technicians training courses that are no longer being relevant to what they're actually trying to reskill themselves for. So we've actually created a commitment to try to allow our employees to have every possible element in their toolkit to retrain themselves. But what we try to do is them state intent. Right? Our bargain with the employees is really simple. We'll pay for all these nano degrees, all these courses, all this training, but you got to do it on your own time. Your call. Okay? We're going to give you all the information that we can about what are the jobs of the future and what's going to exist and what's going to shrink. And then you make a choice. I'm going to ride it out and retire before that shift happens, or I'm going to reskill myself in the state and intent. And then the courses they served up are served on intent of where they intend to go, as opposed to where they are today.
Yeah.
And that's why finding ways to allow customers or employees or people to guide some of that journey is an important element of hyper-personalization, as long as it was said before, as long as that data is being provided with the intent of allowing you to give them better information and choices. That is very important. Yeah. You're not trying to do it to disqualify somebody.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I love that example, because you're right. They are able to, through all the courses, personalize their career path.
Correct.
And they're not they're not feeling like they're being excluded from career paths by you. It's all open, but they have to walk that path to show you their intent.
That's right.
You've got the intent to help them along the way, but they have to show their intent to want to get there. That's great. Coming back to the videos you shared about inclusive design, right? The guide for the vision impaired, either low sight or blind people, the prosthetic limbs. I'm really struck by we're seeing this more and more now, where designs or innovations that get created that are initially for a niche audience, like blind people, start to come over to other audiences. And one of the examples, we've talked a lot about Netflix today, but they started doing subtitles on television shows, and then they were surprised that people were playing the audio sort of overdub in their cars to listen to the movies and the TV shows almost as audiobooks. And they had not thought of that as a use case for this group. So I wonder, and this is a question for any of you, but how do you think about both getting it right when you're trying to do inclusive design, but then also looking for potential designs that you create for a specific audience that could potentially be scaled or brought to a larger audience?
Well, I think it's a difficult thing to do, because you have to, you have to go out kind of into a little bit of the abyss to see what may or may not happen. I'll give you a clear example, which is, so as somebody who's kind of more kind of the environmental side of things and packaging, there's a lot of, appropriately in my opinion, anti-packaging on a lot of stuff. Again, using just a pure pet example, which is, so I, for my dog, have a plastic container that sits at home, and that's what I scoop his food out twice a day. And I go to the store, I buy my bag, I come in, I cut it open, I pour it into the plastic container, I take that bag, I throw it away. Okay, well, is there then the opportunity to take that plastic container into the store and fill it up out of a bin and refill it? And what does that sort of look like? And how do we create some of those dynamics? And how do you there are a lot of different foods that are out there, and people are making choices across a lot of different things. Well, are you going to have like 500 serving bins? Okay, probably not. Okay, well, you can't then go, well, everybody in the world should have one, because that's kind of counterintuitive to all of the discussion and, frankly, all of the science around what goes into pet health and what's good. And so how do you bring those two things? Well, we haven't solved it. We've been trying to. But how do you bring, some of those dynamics forward, and how do you kind of create some of those sorts of scenarios? And I think a product that I'm always a bit fascinated about is OnStar, which I think at first was the study of it was there to be around kind of being a local guide. It never turned into a local guide, right? Now, there's TV commercials about the car hanging off the cliff, and they're there to help save you, and that sort of dynamic. And, it was interesting, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I was driving a car, and all of a sudden I had my phone, and it was saying my directions. And my grandmother, who unfortunately passed away last year, but passed away at 99, but 10 years ago, she's like, who's the woman telling you where to go? Like, it just was like this sort of like insanely foreign concept. She's like, and she literally said, she's like, well, when does she have time to go to the bathroom? And I'm like, you kind of all of a sudden, like, it was like this, like whacking yourself in the face going like, wow, like, okay. Now, again, extreme example.
Yeah.
But, here is a dynamic where the idea of knowing where you needed to go in a car was something you needed to know before you got in the car, and there wasn't this sort of dynamic. And so when you think about different tools that are kind of around that, is how do you think about what those next solutions are, and what is the reality of the outcome of that, and how do you then utilize that to personalize for who needs what, and what does that all look like? So.
Yeah.
And we kind of look at use cases in sort of vertical and horizontal context to try to basically do what you're saying. You develop it for one group, but then it applies elsewhere. I'll just give you a live example. A few days ago, we had the president of our public sector business unit come in and sit in on my team's town hall, right? And he was going to come and talk to us. And he came in early, and he got to hear many of the vertical groups talk about. We have a group focused on manufacturing, supply chain, and transportation. And all the solutions they're working on are basically logistics, supply chain, visibility solutions, optimizing fleet movement because of all the stuff we can do with our network, right? And then we had another team come and talk about what we're doing on remote help and things of that nature. And at the end, he said, I have a great public sector team from your side, Abhi, that supports me, but I just want to remind you, who's the country's largest fleet operator? Well, that would be the US government. Interesting, never thought about that. Okay, USPS, think of the US Army. He said, think of, who's the company that is driving a tremendous amount of, and he gave like 4 examples of use cases. We weren't thinking about government, we were very focused on developing all of these solutions like what you saw. Came out because we have a vertical group focused on healthcare. We have a foundry, which was referenced earlier, you saw that in there. And I had the pleasure of starting that up several years ago in a job 3-4 times removed. But he said, we could use many of these vertical use cases if you kind of start abstracting or thinking a little bit about my horizontal use cases and my vertical. And so we now actually have a regular coordination session in different groups to talk about what they're doing, because the person in each realm knows their business. The person in each area is coming with the innovation in their area. And that's one of the reasons why we cooperate a lot with these companies, because half of these ideas we can enable, but we don't know about. So why not open up your network and let people build on it, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe just briefly in my world, HR tech, and looking at HireVue, one key focus is, as I said, diversity and inclusion. And we have, I mentioned a couple of affordances, or colorblindness we talked about. Another sort of example would be that for certain candidates, we allow them actually to re-record their answers to digital interviews. And initially, that was only thought for a certain subsegment of candidates. But speaking with our customers, it turns out that there's really now 2 schools of thought developing. There's one sort of employer who really would like to be the digital interview as close as possible to an in-person interview. So you only get one shot at the question, and then you're being assessed based on your answer. And if you're nervous, too bad, that can also happen in an in-person interview. But then there's also another school of thought emerging that is also, I think, probably more in line with a candidate-centric, candidate-friendly experience, that you allow the candidate to really put their best foot forward. And if they want to re-record the question, they may have a reason for that, and you give them the chance to do that, even if they don't have certain disabilities, but rather have this as part of the mainstream process. And our experience with that has been very good. So it's probably not a good idea to let them re-record the questions as often as they like, because there's some people, you'd be surprised, who would go, like 80 times through one question. But if you sort of have a certain number of attempts, basically, that seems to be a very, very good process. Maybe it's like 3 or 5 times you allow them to re-record a question if necessary. That can create a more candidate-centric experience and can actually also result in better insights when it comes to talent assessment and talent identification.
That's interesting. It almost seems it would be an indication that they care.
Absolutely.
That they're taking enough time to re-record the answers and go through it again.
We look at this we have clearly defined certain how the data and the features are impacting our models, but there's also a layer of metadata or paradata, if you want, all sorts of these behavioral data points that we are collecting that are increasingly used in our assessments. Absolutely. Perseverance, or maybe it's on the other end of the side, it's perfectionism. So all these kind of things can come into play and can be, based on that behavior, can be analyzed.
Great. I wanted to ask, and Abhi, I'd start with you on this one. who are you doing this with? And you called out a couple of these companies, and you were just alluding to it in your last answer as well, but there's a huge potential here for collaborations, for bringing in partners who are experts in some of these areas or applications of these technologies. How do you think about that kind of landscape, who you're working with on these areas?
So a lot of what I talked about was enabling other companies. I'll give you one example. We're doing it for ourselves, right? So we've done one of the largest retail operations in the country. We have about 5,500 stores. We have a massive website, a lot of presence on our website, call centers all over the place. And we were thinking about how do we provide really hyper-personalized experiences to customers, including, your sainted grandmother right now, right? But who are not familiar with this technology. And we partnered on that with a new startup company called Enjoy, which is run by Ron Johnson, who developed that Apple retail shopping experience. He's got a new company called Enjoy right now. And what we do is we completely tightly integrate our company's databases and our online ordering. So you heard of buy online, pick up in store. So think of this as buy online, and actually have the store come to your house and set it up for you with like a inventory based on your past preferences. And so literally his company has pioneered how to do this in an incredibly efficient, brilliant, delightful, enjoyable customer experience where literally somebody will show up with a Remova suitcase, open it up, and in there is everything that is required but is tailored to what you would want to shop from, that subset of the stores in there, and they actually help you set up your device, get the most of it. And when they leave, typically they have bought like 3 times what they would have normally bought from you because they know how to actually use it.
Yes.
And they know how to make the most of it.
Yeah.
And again, this is a great scenario where, the point about hyper-personalization, if you get it wrong, imagine sending somebody with a whole suitcase of iPhone accessories to somebody who's an Android fan. That would be like a disaster. Right? But that's an example of partnering with somebody who's just so good at what they do that even though we're a big company, we can't do it all. Why not partner with somebody?
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, look, I think, it's a great thing, and obviously most don't have the network and infrastructure, obviously, that you guys do to be able to kind of allow that. But I think I think a very different business dynamic that has accelerated dramatically, in my opinion, over the last 10 to 15 years has been the importance of partnering. In that, because the pace of change, because of the pace of innovation, because of the activities that are happening out there, you have to find others. I think Scott talked about it earlier, but just as you bring innovation in, you got to look outside because it's just it doesn't mean you don't have it inside. It's just you have to figure out how to activate it and activate it in a way that allows somebody to go after it. And it's been a kind of dynamic of internally for us, okay, there's some that have been to go figure out kind of with the external folks how to do that, and some how do you do it internally. We created several joint ventures. We were in the pet pharmacy business, and there's this company called Express Scripts that fills a whole lot of prescription medications, frankly, at higher accuracy, greater speed, and with greater information. And we were like, well, we could either continue to invest in our little pet pharmacy that we were running, which is less than 1% in terms of volume is what they did, or we created a joint venture with them. Even though we were doing it successfully. We had all the opportunities to do that, but they could actually improve us, allow us to do what we do well, which was engaging with the customer, creating personalized experiences, creating recommendations, doing all the things we wanted to do, and let Express Scripts be amazing at what they are, which is if they know what they need to pick, pack, and ship to a customer in a regulated environment where pill count, dosage, all that stuff is really important, and they're amazing at it. And so, great, let's let them do that, and we'll do the other part. And I think those then allow you to take time, our most valuable asset, and reorient it back to the things that matter most for us. And so I think those are dynamics to allow companies to go, which way do I want to go? And whether it's open networks or allowing kind of opportunities for people to test on some things, or its ability to be able to kind of go in and create dynamic interactions on stuff, you have to let those things happen, or else you're just not going to get very far, in my opinion. So.
Yeah.
Maybe just this last point, for us also as a software company and as a software scale-up, if you want, tech integrations are hugely important. So the most obvious one would be sort of the large HR systems that some of our enterprise clients are using, applicant tracking systems, be it a Workday or be it whatever kind of a provider they're using. It's very important that we have not only an integration, but the really good and the high-quality integration, so that we create a really frictionless, seamless hiring and assessment workflow for not only candidates but also for the employers, right?
Right.
And I think the other area is as we are sort of very focused on, with our next generation assessments on machine learning and on artificial intelligence, we obviously need to be very much sort of up to speed in terms of what some of the large players are doing, what the Google is doing, what the Microsoft is doing, and really sort of, to a certain extent, build our tech based on what they are doing and build our tech into their offerings. So integration is very important. Alliance is very important. Partnership is very important.
Great. Okay, we have some time for audience questions. I don't know if there's microphones going around. I see a hand going up already. Great. Why don't you give it a try shouting it out, and we'll hope for the best. Mike's on the way. Here it comes, right behind you. Thank you.
So this is with regard to HR tech. I'm old enough to remember applying for my first job in the newspaper, so there were lots of barriers to entry there, but it was an environment filled with friction. And actually, my dad worked for Xerox for 40 years. And I asked him, he's one of the smartest guys I know, and I asked him, how many times he was poached while working at Xerox, and the answer was 0. And he said if he was, he probably wouldn't have gone anywhere anyway because he was happy working at Xerox. They sort of planned his life. So when you talk about the frenetic environment that we live in today, with like people jumping jobs left and right, as a leader in a small business, that's a huge issue, and it's a difficult one. So having the right sort of fit for an employee to an organization is important to the organization, but it's also important to the employee. So when I look at, okay, the data says that this employee is going to sort of fit well in my leadership team, is there any plans to sort of like broadcast that feedback to the user? So in other words, you're 72% match with this company. So I know that if I got turned down, it's probably the chemistry isn't right, as opposed to just, they didn't like you. And then also, I would hope to go somewhere, and as I get older, I hope to stay at the place that I'm at for a longer period of time. The allure of $10,000, $20,000 more is not going to drive me. But for younger people, they're just like, oh, look, that place is better to go, and then they kind of go there. So I'm just interested if you have plans on that end.
Yeah, no, these are really good observations and really good points, and we think about all those quite a bit. I mean, one thing I briefly mentioned is internal mobility, right? You may be applying for a job, and you may be hired for one job, but you may sort of, it's more and more sort of a journey, ideally within the same employer, that you can sort of transition into other jobs. And also when we are thinking about the assessments we're creating, we don't only want to assess the status quo, are you good for this fairly junior position, but we also want to assess your potential and your learning agility and your leadership potential, right? We're working, for example, with some very interesting we have some very interesting partnerships also with, for example, executive search firms and with recruitment firms, and based on the frameworks that they are using to assess leaders and identify leadership potential, we can also, develop our tools to take this into account. So it's not only about the status quo, it's about the potential of the candidate, and it's about internal mobility, helping them to sort of develop into more responsibility and more managerial roles. All that is very much on our agenda. We don't really see it as a transactional hiring project that we are helping employers with, but it's really sort of the journey and the career path that we want to help them with. Matching, leadership potential, all these things would fit in there.
Thank you. Yeah, we got a question right here. Keep an eye out.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. The first is for the AT&T platform. How do you, who basically owns the IP, and how do you address that? And also, what is the, how do you structurize your cost for usage? The second question is HR-related question. I'm a business owner, and one of the greatest epiphany that I have gotten today is the statement that was made that employees don't work for a company, the company works for the employee. And with that in mind, how do you ensure that these assessment tools are tailored in a way where we bring out the company working for the employee as opposed to this almighty company trying to pick among these talents for the best talent?
So
the answer to your first question, it depends on the nature of the commercial relationship they have with us. Okay, I'll give you two extremes of the commercial relationships you could have. One is you're completely just working with us to essentially embed our technology in your product to make it better, and you do so on commercial terms of how you will basically get the data, source the data. We will help you engineer the network for that. The other place is more for, and then that situation, you own your IP. We supply you all the services required to connect your device at a commercial rate. The other situation is when you come into one of our foundries as a startup trying to create a new concept, okay? And for that, we had to actually go through a lot of convolutions in IP. That was actually one of the thorniest areas, because in that, we have not just our IP, we have some of the network enabling IPs, because you're now at the cutting edge. So you'll have access to a network that has not yet been launched. For example, in the 5G space, there are these new technologies called network slicing, where you can literally provide a slice of a network with different characteristics, which floats out there virtually, okay? That has not yet been deployed. But if we are going to not sequentialize speeding up the future, you got to find ways to. So what we do is we run that in a network that's walled off from our production network. You don't want somebody coming to the device that might actually bring down like half the United States in terms of what you're doing, because you run a lot of critical infrastructure. So we wall it off and make it available through APIs in a pre-production environment. In the scenario where you're creating something completely new, we have a separate set of rules that govern our foundries that are different than the rest of our company. So it's at a distance. And in there, basically, to simplify the legalese, it's what's yours is yours, what's mine is mine, what we create together is ours. Okay, that's a concept that we had to come up with. And trust me, it was a big battle with our lawyers and everybody else's lawyers to actually get to that particular idea. So we have different constructs depending on the nature of your relationship with us.
Yeah, and to address the second question, also really important points raised here. I think one sort of, and I mentioned, I briefly touched on this earlier, our mission is to democratize the hiring process, and we want actually to create a more human application process, a more human assessment process by actually using our technology. And one reason why we can make this claim, I think, is that these scientifically developed models, in our view, if they're done correctly, are superior to a human assessment and the human judgment, which is, as I said, in many cases, riddled by bias. Yeah. So by using our scalable tech, we give more people the chance to apply for a job. We give them a fair shot to actually end up getting the job. Maybe one other nugget here that is important. We don't necessarily want to automate the hiring decision, but we want to inform the hiring decision done by humans. So we basically put humans in a better position to make the right call by surfacing the most promising candidates. And then the other aspects are just by using next generation modalities, using gaming, using sort of a more interactive sort of video approach rather than a survey, or rather than sort of a automated maybe phone screening. We give candidates a better experience. That's also why some of the employers we're working with see a significant increase, for example, in candidate net promoter scores and all these kind of things, because it's a more candidate-friendly, candidate-centric process. That's sort of at the very core at what we're doing. And I think the other thing is really some of the aspects that I had mentioned. We provide, for example, feedback, developmental feedback, growth mindset-oriented feedback that can point even a candidate that gets rejected in the right direction. Or we can also use this information, that goes to the first question, to maybe identify a better fit job within that organization. So you may end up not applying for a certain job at a large company such as Unilever, but you may end up applying at Unilever, and then we help you sort of find the right job for you to the extent that makes sense in the use case. Does that answer the question?
I think we can take one more question. If there is one more question, and then I'll squint this way too. Nope. Doesn't look like it. Nope. Okay, well then how about a round of applause for our three panelists? Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.